begin the dialogue session with Minister Mentor Lee Kuan Yew. May I invite Minister Mentor and Professor Mahbubani onto the stage, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome to the podium for this dialogue. I can say that since I became the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, one of the most persistent requests that I've received from the students at the school is they would love to have an opportunity to meet or to have a dialogue with So this evening is a real gift to the students of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. We're going to have a question and answer session. As a moderator, I'll pose the first question, and then I'll encourage the students and, of course, all members of the audience to pose the question to My first question to you, is that there has been a great deal of reflections among governments around the world on the causes of the great global financial crisis that we've experienced in the last year or two. Many, of course, believe that serious errors were made. I believe that many governments around the world would be interested in in finding out your reflections on this crisis. In your view, what were the 2 or 3 leading causes for this crisis? And also, apart from the obvious errors made by the banking sector, what were the key failures in governance from your point of view,
Well, there are many more competent people, even in this hall, who can give you a more accurate answer. I've just met Paul Volcker this afternoon.
Paul Volcker is here,
And I met Victor Halberstad, and my finance minister is also well clued up. But I'll venture my impressions. I believe it is the excesses of the liberal system of regulations and the belief that a completely free market will allow enormous innovation and great benefits all around, capital allotted to the most profitable enterprises and the highest returns. So once the Congress and the Fed chairman decided that it was not necessary to regulate the derivatives and to supervise them, I think then the fuse was lit. Because once you find that you can mash up a lot of good and bad assets in one bundle and pass it on and collect your brokerage or whatever they call it, and so it goes all around Europe and other parts of the world. You've started something like a Ponzi scheme, which must come to an end sometime. And the absurdity was, there were people like Stephen Roach who kept on writing, I think for Morgan Stanley, extremely critical and Cassandra-like articles, analysis. This is going through the roof. It's a bubble. But the Fed chairman didn't say so. He did not think so. He thought it was the higher productivity by the new methods of production, internet and so on. And that there was no inflation, so let it go. I think a combination of those two, no regulations and the belief that it's all right. I had a discussion once with the Fed chairman. I said, properties are going through the roof. He said, no. It depends on which city you're in. Some cities are overbuilt, some cities are underbuilt. So it's difficult to generalize. But by the time you're able to mortgage your house and it keeps on rising, you buy another house, and that keeps on rising. It must come to an end somewhere. And the end came, and that was the trigger. But the long fuse was lit, I think, by the belief that the free market was the best and no regulations was required for derivatives. And the business of a person in a financial institution is to make the biggest profits for himself. So I say just condemning the bankers and the profit takers doesn't make sense. You've allowed these rules and they work within these rules and they passed on their dark assets. It should not have been allowed, but it was, so we are where we are. Maybe we learn from this, maybe we don't, but I think however we learned, whatever lessons we learned, I believe the free market system, from time to time, you must expect a glitch and a failure in the market. It happens regularly. So if you believe it, you learn a lesson from this, and ever after it'll be no more crisis. And I think that's silly. It won't happen that way. It's the way of the free market economies. The other way, of course, is to regulate it like the Soviet Union did or the Chinese did before. Now the Chinese are somewhere in between. They used to believe that the American Anglo-Saxon model was the most effective, but they were cautious. They didn't want to get there too quickly. They kept their capital markets closed. They kept a pretty tight control on what the banks were doing. So they have come out relatively unscathed. That's the way I see it. And fortunately, our banks here thought that they were not smart enough to understand what these derivatives were, and they didn't deal in them, so we were spared.
Yeah. Thank you, Amen. I'm going to ask the floor. I see a student over here. Please, can you ask the first question? Identify yourself, please.
Yeah. Good evening. My name is Taufik Indra Kusuma. I am an MPP student from Indonesia. And Minister Mentor, sir, tonight I would like to ask a question about Indonesia. Because I believe that Indonesia currently faces a situation which you have often warned against, which is when there are too many voices in the marketplace and the government is too easily swayed by public opinion. Thus, it becomes very difficult for the government to implement long-term planning for development or to implement sound public policy because it bends over backward to accommodate all of these different voices, many of which are often uneducated or misinformed or otherwise misguided and usually nearsighted. So how do you believe a country like Indonesia should deal with this type of situation? Thank you.
Do you expect me to endorse your statement? My business is to maintain the friendly relations. I would not venture to suggest why there is this hesitation in coming to decisions, whether it's multiplicity of voices or I think I'll pass that question.
The next question, yeah. Please identify yourself, yes.
My name is Anu Singh, and I'm also a student at the Kuan Yew School, originally from India. 5 years ago at the founding dinner, you had predicted great things for China and India and cited to India's secular democracy as key to its future success. 5 years on, I just wanted to ask your opinion on how well you think India's government is doing in separating religion and politics, and perhaps what advice could you give to India's new breed of leaders?
I think all the governments want your advice.
It's nearly as sensitive and difficult a question as the last one. But I'll give you my experience of India. I think despite all the failings, highly bureaucratic, red tape, inefficient linkages between central and state governments, unwieldy coalitions in the center and unwieldy coalitions in the states. The progress is made is quite remarkable. I mean, 6, 7, 8% growth. Once Manmohan Singh and Chidambaram opened up in the 90s after the IMF said, you've got to open up. I think India is under some constraints, not the result of the politicians, but the result of the nature of the constitution and the nature of the society. China is homogeneous, 90% Han. So when the president stands up and the TV is on, more than 90% understand him because the minorities are also learning Chinese, Putonghua. So given those constraints, it's done well. Any Indian leader speaking in any language at one time doesn't reach more than, say, 40%. You speak in Hindi, you might get the Hindi North. You speak in English, you get the upper classes throughout the country, maybe 30%. You speak in Tamil, you get 70 million in Tamil Nadu, and you speak in Malayalam, I don't know how many, 40 million. So that is an enormous diversity which makes it difficult to get the same policies through. And you can see that after each election you get a tussle of how to form governing coalitions. But on the other hand, because it's kept this constitution fluid, so a country with about 30, 40 different ethnic groups and 320 dialects and languages has held together. That's quite an achievement. Then you have the problem of the constitution. I was in Bombay 2 years ago, and now this is a fact, and I don't think the Deputy Chief Minister will take offense at my recounting what actually took place and his position. So he asked me if I would spend 3 hours discussing how to make Bombay a world financial center. So I thought, well, why not? So he brought all his main ministers, state ministers, and his officials. Halfway through the dialogue, I asked him, who governs Bombay? He said, there's a committee that runs Bombay. I said, but who provides it with the revenue? He said, we do, the state government. What happens to Bombay's revenue? It goes to the state government. I said, then how do you dispense with that revenue? He says, well, we spread it throughout the Maharashtra state because there are so many farmers and so on, everybody has got to be looked after. I then said to him, if you want Bombay to become like Shanghai, Pudong, then you make it a self-governing unit, which the Chinese have done in Shanghai, in Tianjin, in Chongqing, and a few other cities recently. Then they deal direct with the central government. The central government gives them the funds for the infrastructure, and the revenue is shared with the central government, not with the... Shanghai doesn't share revenue with either Jiangsu or Zhejiang or any of the neighboring states. It shares it with the central government. And the central government has invested enormous sums of money to make it a dragon head that goes up the Yangtze River right up to the Tibetan mountains. And there was a period when you had empty building blocks, but it doesn't matter. I mean, the central government has decided this is going to be a great international center, and they set out to make it one, and now it is one. So I said, do that. He looked at me and says, what will happen to my farmers? I said, you just got to deal with the central government. He says, no, The central government won't give me anything more. So the discussion ended there. So I said, well, then how do you solve this airport, which is not world class? The road from the airport to the city, which is not what you expect of a first world financial center. And the city itself, the planning is not as good as it would be if it were governed separately. This can't be done. So 2 days later, I was in Delhi and I met the Prime Minister. I said, this problem can be solved. You see, it's China, make it an independent unit. The Prime Minister looked at me and said, you don't understand. I will never get this passed through Parliament. I said, why? You have to go to Parliament. Yes. He said, all this requires an amendment in the legislation, in the Constitution, and that requires a 2/3 majority or some in the central government and in the states. We'll never get it passed. So Bombay will always be at the mercy of the Maharashtra government, and the Maharashtra government, quite wisely, takes its revenue and gives it to the farmers because they are the people who voted them in. So until you break that chain, how do you break the chain?
Thank you. Next question over here.
Minister Mentor, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Wang Yan, and currently an MPA student. I come from China, and to be specific, Jiangsu province, a place shares a lot with and owns a lot to you and to your country. My question is about real China versus imagined China. Because I doubt that there's an easy way for China to explain to the rest of the world what is really going on in this country, while itself is going through unprecedented transitions. Among all living leaders around the world, I think you are the only one that has been to China 30 times, I think, and that can speak excellent Chinese. So what does a real China look like in your eyes? And what are the major reasons that you believe how China sees itself and how the rest of the world, especially the West, sees China, are persistently out of alignment? Do you believe in a peaceful rise of China? And if you do, would you please kindly advise how China should act to effectively convince others that the rise of China is not a threat to the world? Thank you very much.
You get very different questions, Emil.
Yeah. I'll have to do a very carefully crafted thesis to answer you, which I'm not qualified to do. You live there, you've grown up there, you've been educated there. How can I know China better than you do? But just seeing China on 32 different visits over the last since 1976, that's about 33 years, I would say it's been a remarkable transformation. The China I visited in 1976 was dilapidated, down, gray, drab, everybody in the same Mao jackets, unlit streets. I was put up in the best hotel in Shanghai. I went down at night after dinner to see what it's like, and dark streets, unlighted shops, and whole streams of people. So you've got to keep on moving, otherwise you're holding everybody up. Overcrowded. Well, you go to Shanghai, unbelievably, it's widened the roads, they've greened up the place, huge tremendous improvements in their infrastructure. So that's coastal China, and you can find that in Guangzhou, Dalian, Tianjin, all the coastal cities. I've also been to the interior. I've been to Lanzhou and to see the caves in Dunhuang. And it was an arid place. It's got oil, and the oil has got to be shared with 1.3 billion people. So if Lanzhou were just looking after itself with its 40 million, might be quite a wealthy little oil state, but it's not as. So what is the real China? I think there are multiple real Chinas, depending, even within a province. But given the diversity of the country, the progress is made is quite outstanding. Can it have a peaceful rise? Quite possible. For 20, 30, 40 years. Will it be peaceful after it has risen? I cannot say. Because, every year since 1976, the relationship of China between Singapore and China, yes, it's good, it's friendly, but in 76, they were asking me questions about the free market, about many things. Now we are talking at a different level. I'm talking to people who read enormously and been briefed. So we are talking at a different level, and the relationship is at a more realistic level. You can't ask me with 4 million people to give advice to 1.3 billion people. I don't think it's wise anyway of me, and I'll cease to be friends if I do that. But I'll say what I think is good about China and a few things about what will hold it up. One, they've got the system going. When they say we will do this, it's done. The difference between India and China is stark. In India, Delhi can say, do that. But the chief minister says, you're not appointing me, I follow you. It's my voters who will make me the chief minister in the next election. So I say, yes, of course, but I don't do it. But in China, when they tell the party secretary, this must be done, and you don't do it, in the next reshuffle, you'll move sideways. So if you want to get up to the Politburo, you make sure it's a success. So you take Suzhou, all the 6 or 7 officials that we dealt with, and they were very able ones, they are now right at the top. 2 party secretaries, 1 member of the Politburo in charge of discipline and so on, a very important post. Because that's the way it is, the system works, because if you perform, I promote you. You don't perform, you're out. Sideways. So that's a systemic difference. The other thing that impresses me is the quality of the men that's coming up. 76, I met revolutionaries. Everywhere you went in the provinces, coming Wei Hui. So the Revolutionary Committee greets you, and their sum total of knowledge is Marxism, communism, Leninism, and Maoism. And now you're meeting a different generation. The younger you go, the more Western educated they are, the more they're familiar with the world, and the higher the quality, and I think they got the system in order. You have to retire at that age. 65 in the center In the provinces, mayors retire at 60, party secretary 65. Even in the center, you're very good and you go on to 70. Now, what is the bad side? Well, the bad side is, first, a dysfunctional system because of the corruption, a lot of unhappiness at lower levels. How to be rid of it? It's a very difficult job because all communist countries face this problem. During the time when the economy was controlled, money is useless. You can have a lot of paper money, but you can't go, there's nothing in the shops. You go to the shops that your pecking order decides. I'm cadre first class, and I go hospital first class, shops first class, I buy all these things. You are cadre 9th class, and you go to a different kind of class. You are not even a cadre. Well, that's too bad. On one of my tours, this is where there's a bit of hypocrisy. One of the people who accompanied us was wearing this Mao suit. So I said, what you see? I show you. He unbuttoned himself and said, fur line inside. And if you're an ordinary fellow, you don't have a fur line Mao. You just shiver, you put on more layers of cotton. But they maintain this egalitarian look. Now, the problem now is with that egalitarian look, the poor are being squeezed at lower levels, and they see little officials getting prosperous and leading a good life, and they are not in their land. They don't own the land, but nevertheless, having tilled the land, and they expect adequate compensation, and they don't get it, so you get riots. So I think there are serious problems of equity there, and with CCTV now, you can see how beautiful Beijing is, how beautiful Shanghai is, and I'm still in my mud house, or my mud hut. When is my turn? Nobody knows. I mean, maybe 50 years, 60 years, because the trickle-down effect will take a very long time. So the present leadership is putting all the infrastructure in the less developed areas. But can you convert it quickly? I don't think so. Educational levels are lower, cultural levels are lower, you've got to educate them. Teachers don't want to go to such provinces, good teachers, because where are the facilities for your children's education and hospitals and so on? So it'll be a problem getting them up to speed. So the corruption, inequality, and misbehavior, especially at lower levels, will lead to all kinds of problems, which can be contained because they've got a very powerful apparatus. People's security police, the army, the party. But if you want a country to progress, you must carry the people with you at all levels, which they did when they shared misery. But now the prosperity is not shared equally. I mean, you are here, you're from Jiangsu, it's one of the prosperous provinces. You're well dressed, you're well educated, you speak English. If you were in Lanzhou or Xinjiang, I don't think you'll have a chance to travel and be in Singapore. So these disparities will be serious problems. So the internal problem is the most important single difficulty you must attend to. Peaceful rise, it is in China's interest to grow in a peaceful environment. If you are engaged in wars or conflicts, you won't grow. I mean, you see Vietnam. From 1945 to 1991, they were engaged in a series of wars. Nearly broke them. Now they are recovering. It took a long time. And the Chinese know this. This generation has been through hell. Great leap forward, hunger, starvation, near collision with the Russians over the Amur River, cultural revolution, gone mad. So they said, okay, we've got a chance now to join the other countries at the top. Let's not disturb this opportunity. So hence this concept of peaceful rise. I met the party school vice principal. He asked me to speak to the students once. So I said, you know, if I were you, I would not use the word peaceful rise in English. It sounds all right in Chinese, 崛起, but in English it means you're rising as like a mushroom, you know, you scare people. Why not say cultural renaissance, that you're going back to Tang Dynasty or Sung Dynasty or Han Dynasty, a restoration of your cultural efflorescence. That will make people concentrate on the cultural side. So they now settle for peaceful development. I see they've moved away from peaceful rise. I have no doubts that they will have they want a peaceful rise. This generation. But the grandchildren may think that they have already arrived, and then they begin to flex their muscles, and then you will have a very different China. So I put this question to them. They said, no, it won't happen. We'll tell them. Teach them all the lessons. You know, the grandchildren never listen to grandfathers. So that's one problem. The other problem is a more crucial one. If you start off in the belief that the world has been unkind to you, that the world has exploited you, that the imperialists have devastated you, you know, looted Beijing, done all this to you. One day you get to the top table, you'll square accounts. Well, that's no good. I think you must get a generation to grow up and say, look, you're not going back to old China when you were just the only power in the world, as far as you know. Rome was far away. And the Silk Road, well, you can't invade each other. But you are now going to grow, let's say in 50 years, with an economy, total GDP more than America, easily more than Japan, but per capita still low. But you are just one of many other powers, many of them more innovative, more inventive, more resilient in meeting with changes in technology and changes in social lives and so on. So I tell my American friends, if I were you, I wouldn't worry about them today, you know, democracy and so on. Leave it to them. You've got tens of thousands of bright Chinese students in America. You give them a bad impression, a bad time, they'll go home nursing a grievance. You accept them as friends and say, look, this is one world, global warming. We will be in trouble, you will be in trouble. AIDS, terrorism, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons. It's a different world. China will not be the sole power. But sometimes, I'm not talking about people at the top, I think they understand this. But the people at the bottom, middle ranges, I mean, when the Deputy Prime Minister, our Deputy Prime Minister, who's now Prime Minister, went to Taiwan, the barrage of vicious articles on him on the internet from young students was intense. Suddenly, from a good old friend, we became a brand new enemy. Overnight, No, that gives us cause for reflection. So I said to some of my Chinese friends, I said, you know, you better tell your young people, if you say we are old friends, then we have to stay old friends for a long time. You can't say, suddenly I do something which you don't like and we become an enemy. I'm not sure if they can get the young people to understand that, because they are growing up in a different China, a China which they feel is going to come up very quickly, 崛起. I'm not sure it's going to come up without troubles. I think enormous social problems will crop up, disparity, corruption, all kinds of problems. But the crucial question that the world wants to know is, having arisen or having fully developed, what kind of a China, what kind of power is it going to be? Because by then you'll be 1,500 million or 600 million, educated, organized. It can become. Now they keep on saying, we are not going to be a hegemon. Never. No, I believe it for their lifetime. But as I think of the young attacking us, I think overnight I became an enemy. How is that? So I explained it to my friends. I said, no, when you do that, you annoy 1.3 billion people, 13 亿. That caused me to pause again. So when you annoy me, you only annoyed 4 million people. But I thought you said all countries, big and small, are the same. So I begin to have doubts about that. But never mind, I think it is still in the formative stage. And if I were America, Europe, and Japan, I would spend time to make sure that the mindset of the younger generation is not one of hostility, but one of acceptance and an understanding that you are now a stakeholder, which was Bob Zweig's very apt description of their role. When they were called a stakeholder, they asked me, what is a stakeholder? I said, it means you got a stake in it, and if it goes down, you will lose money. I said, after some time, they said, yeah, that's right. So stakeholders are a good idea. So make them feel they're stakeholders, and if this earth goes warm, they're in as much trouble as anybody else. Thank you.
Thank you, MM. I see we have about 10 minutes and 3 questionnaires here, MM. I'll try and see whether we can go through all 3. Number 1, number 2, number 3. So over there first, please.
Yes, sir. My name is John Roberts. I am a MPP senior. Sir, I work for a charity.
MPP senior.
I work for a charity, and I'm interested in development issues. I admire your achievements and would thus like to know what lessons, in your opinion, can developing countries learn from Singapore's skillful balance between national self-determination and the need to develop rapidly with the current international pressure being put on the developing world to engage its citizens in policy formulation?
The dilemma is between how do you maintain, in a sense, the tough policies that Singapore maintains and the pressure to have, I guess, a more open environment. That's the kind of dilemma that...
That's no dilemma as far as I'm concerned. I've just been talking to my neighbor, Mr. Zhang Yongfa from Taiwan, and he was describing to me what a disaster Taiwan now is. He says, democracy, he says, we are now in a total state of disorder, and the future is very bleak. He says, you are doing the right thing, and I wish we were like you. So I said to him, but I'm constantly being attacked in America for being authoritarian. He says, no, I pay no attention to them. So, you see, in Asia, and Asia is important to me because it's the fastest growing area and we're going to grow with them. They see all pluses and no minuses. In America, you see more minuses than pluses. I said, well, good luck to you. I might also add, but I don't repeat this. Mr. Chang Yong-fa told me, America is not such a great example, you know. So I think the conversation ended there. I make no apologies.
Okay. On the right here.
I'm not elected by the American press or American media. I'm elected by the people of Singapore.
Over, lady on the right here.
Yes. I'm Catherine Lim, a writer and political commentator.
Who?
Some years ago, I was
Catherine
giving
Lim.
a talk to some British businessmen and, you know, giving my usual spiel on Singapore politics and civic liberties. During the question and answer session, one of the businessmen raised his hand and said, I have a question, or rather a suggestion. Could we please have your Lee Kuan Yew, and in exchange we give you Tony Blair with Sherry Blair thrown in? I said, Mr. Lee is not going to like your noisy, messy, rambunctious democracy. And he said, no matter. And then went on to say that if there were but 5 Lee Kuan Yew scattered throughout Africa, the continent wouldn't be in such a direful state today. Now, after this light-hearted sharing, my question, sir, in the event of a serious threat, a very serious threat of a freak election, would you do the unthinkable? That is, send in the army. Thank you.
Of the what?
Send in the army, do the unthinkable.
What is the danger? What is the situation where that would be contemplated?
Well, this is what I would like to find from you, right? Would you do this?
The question MM is asking you, what is the unthinkable situation?
Oh, in the event of a very serious threat of a freak election, would you do the unthinkable, and that is send in the army?
You look at our record, and you look at the moves we have made. What is she? She's Catherine Lim. Is it?
Catherine Lim, she's a writer. And
Well, I mean, let me put it simply like this. First, we maintain the system which gives any opposition the opportunity to displace us peacefully. And we allow the system. We have not interfered with the civil service, we have not interfered with the judiciary, we have not interfered with the parliamentary procedures on the system, police and so on. And if you can win an election, so be it. And at some time, someplace, we will not be able to find a team which can equal an opposition team. And that day we deserve to be out. If we become corrupt, if we become inefficient, we can't deliver, we're out. Now, what if we have a freak election? As we may well have, because many voters now tell you openly, you know, my family, 3 of us voted for you, but 2 of us voted against you, just to let you know that we want an opposition voice and we don't want you to be so overwhelming. So in that situation, you may have a freak result. And I say, all right, that worries me. So we have set in place a president with blocking powers. So any opposition that comes in will find, first, he cannot touch the reserves. Otherwise, you can promise the sky and spend the money. And all our hard-earned savings will go within 5 years. Second, you can change the top officials without the president's consent. The first 3 or 4 officials and commanders, police and so on, you cannot change them. And if they retire and you want to appoint a new one, the president must approve. And all the government funds, any raiding of the funds, even under our control now, PAP, must be approved by the government, by the president, who has a council of presidential advisors who are very well versed, experienced economists, businessmen, who will advise the president yes or no. Now, why should we do that if we expect to overturn an election. We expect, if we are voted out, to stay out and hope that within one term, that new government, incompetent, unable to deliver, will be out. And there's enough core competencies and the funds to enable a fresh PAP government to revive the system. Why do you think we put in all these safeguards? I spent 15 years thinking out these safeguards and finally persuaded my younger colleagues that we needed this, because they can't guarantee that they'll each time produce a better team than the opposition, just because we've done that in the past. I don't see any problem in the next election, probably the election after that, but if we don't find a good team in the election after that, and the opposition gets a good team together, we are at risk. That's the way it is. You know, one of the first lessons I learned when I went to LSE for one term, I attended Harold Lasky's lectures because he was a great preacher, you know, he was a great orator and a lecturer. And he spent one or two lectures in a crowded lecture room in Houghton Street in London, explaining why Britain is going through this Labour government revolution. He said, if you don't have a system where you allow change and fundamental change by consent, you will have a revolution by violence. And this is because the British have allowed and the middle class acquiesced in the change and later on adopted the National Health Service and a whole host of other social security measures. There was no revolution in Britain as the middle class became less and less well off. He says, so I learned, the first lesson I learned in politics is, you either have a revolution by consent, constitutionally, or a revolution by violence. If we block all possibilities, we must expect violence. And in that violence, eventually the army won't shoot, because you are in the wrong. I mean, that's what happens in Africa. So the army goes in and holds up the president and often shoots him. If we had not these thoughts at the back of our minds, why do we do these things? Now, you're a novelist. I don't know what you dream of or what you imagine, but find a reason why we should do that just to bluff the people, that in fact we're preparing a coup and all the army commanders are our children or relatives. Doesn't make sense. An army commander, Air Force or police has to be approved by a committee, and the president must agree. Why? Because we will appoint that commanders? No, because a stupid government may do the wrong things, and when we return, we may find the whole machinery has collapsed, as often is the case. Simple.
Ma'am, we already passed 10 o'clock. Would you allow the two questioners, just quickly, if you don't mind, since time is passing, just quickly pose your question, and then we'll try and answer both at the same time so that we'll end in 5 minutes or so, please.
Minister Mentor and Sir, just now my comrade from China asked you a question about China. As a Chinese in Singapore, I want to ask you a question about Singapore, especially how Singapore created great leaders like you. Or should I say, great leaders like you created Singapore. But anyway, my question is, how could Singapore continue to develop the next generation of great leaders, leaders that are as great as you are, or even greater than you are? Last night, I talked with my Japanese classmate, and he told me that in Japan, we also need LKY. I'm sorry, excuse our impertinence, but that's how you are called in our school. So,
what do you do here?
She's a student.
I'm a student.
Oh, you're a student.
Yeah, I'm an MPP.
Are you a permanent resident? Are you a citizen, or are you a visitor?
I'm a permanent resident.
How long have you been here?
1 year. so far.
Well, I can't tell you how to find leaders. I'm having trouble finding new leaders in Singapore. It's not easy. If you read American books on leadership, and I went to Harvard once and I met 3 or 4 experts who teach lessons on leadership. You can train leaders and give them knowledge. I start off from a different standpoint. That is from my personal observation. You can make a good company leader by training him. You can't produce a political leader by training him. He must have the passion. He must have the instinct to do something for his fellow men. He must have the capacity to persuade them to follow him. I went to a sheep farm once in Australia. And the farmer had 100-odd sheep on a mountainside. He had 2 or 3 dogs. And he was at the bottom of the hill, and he blew the whistle, and the dogs gathered the sheep into the pen, and he didn't move. So I said, wonderful. How do you choose these dogs? How do you train them? He says, well, we take them as young pups and look at their eyes. If they've got good, strong eyes, and the sheep looks at the dog and is scared, then you've got a starting point. But if he hasn't got the stamina, he hasn't got what it takes, that he will go with you thick and thin the whole day, then drop him. Don't waste time. You train one who's going to is trainable. The capacity is there. It reminded me of a TV Q&A I heard in New York one day. I was in the hotel listening to the program, and there was a man called Singer, something Singer. He writes novels or books in Yiddish. So the interviewer asked him, because he was teaching people how to be writers, says, can you teach a writer? He said, yes, provided he's got it in him to be a writer. Then I will make the process very short. But if he hasn't got it in him, then I'm wasting my time. So I subscribe to that school. So when I look for a successor, I want to see the passion, I want to see the capacity, the integrity, and the ability to persuade. So, but I tell you this little anecdote. In China, I would have gone down the greasy pole a long time ago. I told Deng Xiaoping at dinner in 1976, if he were in Singapore, I'm quite sure he'll be the leader. But if I were in China, in that greasy pole, halfway down, I'll be pushed down to the bottom. That's how fierce the elbows are in China.
Thank you. And just one last
Final
quick
question.
Yes. And then this will be the last question, I'm afraid.
Yes. Minister Mentor, good evening. Ambassador, I'm Rico Hizon from BBC World News, and I'd like to go back full circle to the very first question.
From BBC World News.
BBC World News? I'm not here to be interviewed by the media.
Just a simple question, Minister Mentor. Just full circle back to the financial crisis and on the issue of regulation. Unbridled risk-taking by some bankers has been cited as one of the major reasons that has led to this global financial crisis, and the incentive of lucrative bonus payments has basically led these traders and dealers to take more risks. And there has been a gathering storm, particularly among 2 leaders in Europe, Nicolas Sarkozy of France and Angela Merkel of Germany, to push for a global regulation on bonus payments. Do you think that this initiative will move forward in the G20, and do you support such initiative?
We are in the middle of a crisis we haven't got out of. I think the concentration will be how do we make sure we don't go further deep into this recession and somehow surface. When we are out of this, then we'll begin the more difficult task of what can we do to improve the system. But no improvement can ever prevent another breakdown. I do not believe that. The Europeans believe they can regulate. There's a cost to regulation. I mean, the British and the Americans, had they not gone to these excesses, were making higher returns in their GDP every year. So there's a trade-off. You may be right. I mean, you're in the news business. I mean, you read all the economists and all the wise people who give their views. What you ask me? I mean, I've told you I don't know very much about it. So I accept your statement as another one of a well-informed person. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us. Please join me once again in thanking MM for